Hey everybody, welcome to episode 2 of our 3-part series with our L-1 visa guide. Everything you'd want to know about the L-1, things that most lawyers probably won't even tell you, certainly AI is not going to tell you, to ensure that you have a successful L-1 application that will lead to approval and your ability to come to the US. My name again is Charles Raether. I'm the managing partner here at AmLaw Group, where for nearly 20 years we've been helping people such as yourselves, entrepreneurs, investors, highly skilled professionals make a successful transition to the US. So today's episode, which is second in the 3-part series, today's episode is intended for people that are really seriously looking at the L1. You think you qualify, and we're going to go into some of the details about what is really required, what AI is not going to tell you about the L visa, what you're not going to find out on USCIS's website, to make sure that you have a successful case. So if you're looking at the L1 and you want to do a double check that you really will qualify and be able to successfully pursue a petition through this visa category, stay with us, and we're going to go into the details here about how to ensure a successful case. First of all, as you know from the first episode on the L1, there's really 2 different types of L1 visas: new office applications and existing company applications. So I would say over our 20 years of practice, the vast majority do new company applications. And we'll talk about that in just a moment. We'll start with existing company petitions. Why do we have fewer existing company petitions? Probably because I think clients come to us when they're just getting started with their business development here. And the vast majority of our clients have a business concept already in mind, and they want to develop it here in the US, and they don't want to buy somebody else's business. But there are cases where people would like to buy an existing business. Certainly, if that's the situation you're looking at, there are some advantages to that, but there are also some complications. So let's start with the complications when you're acquiring an existing business in the US. So for purposes of an L1, what does it mean that you have an existing business, that it's not a new business? The Immigration Service for L1 deems a business that's been actively operating for 1 year or longer as being an existing business. Now, there's a bit of a nuance here. That's why we're lawyers, right? We go into the nuances. If you have a business that's been registered for 1 year or longer, but it really hasn't been active, and we can prove that there's been no ongoing regular activities, then in theory we could apply as a new business. Now you might say, Charles, why would I do that? It sounds like an existing business would always be better. It really depends on the client's situation. So what's required for an existing business L1? First thing that's required is you need to show that the business has been actively operating over the last year or so. Now, we usually go back maybe 6 months. We show payroll records, financial statements, tax returns to show that the company has been actively operating as an ongoing entity for at least the previous 6 months. What do they look at? They don't look at so much the profitability. With the L1 and most other USCIS visas, profitability is generally not a threshold question. The government understands you have good years, you have bad years. We're not going to give people visas just based on their profitability. There's maybe 2 things that they really look at, and one of them is the most important. They look at the number of employees and the employment structure. So what does that mean? First, number of employees, that's easy, right? I would say if you've got an existing business, you've got to have at least 8 employees, ideally 10. Anything less, you're running a big risk of a denial. Where do we come up with 8 employees? Why 8? Why not 6? Why not 7? Why not 9? We say a minimum of 8. Now, this isn't in the regs anywhere, so that's why I'm saying AI, USCIS, they're never going to tell you this stuff. This is just things, these are things that you learn from decades of doing this. The employees, where do we come up with the 8 employees? An L1, most of our L1 applications are the executives. There's the CEOs. They're coming to the US, they're going to manage this company when they come here. So they're at the top of the pyramid. Imagine under the CEO, you've got some mid-level managers. For an ongoing L1, and this is also true for a regular L1, a startup, they want to see at least 2 managers who are under the CEO and have a higher education, meaning a bachelor's or higher, and they manage and oversee the other layer of employees below them. So the first thing you're noticing is we have to have a 3-level structure of employees: CEO, mid-level managers, and then regular employees. Because they want to see, as an L1 applicant, especially for an existing business, you're not going to be managing that third level employees directly. You manage the employees through your managers, your mid-level managers, CFOs, CMOs, whatever you want to call them. So that's the first thing they look at. And if you look at it, that's where we kind of come up with the minimum of 8, because you've got 2 managers, 1, 2. Each manager has to manage at least 2 people. Otherwise, if a manager is managing 1 person, that's not really a manager. So you've got 2 managers, 1, 2, and then you've got, at least probably 3 subordinates under each manager. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So total you get an 8, 2 managers, and each one manages 3 people. You can try to get by with 2 managers and 2 subordinates under each manager. I think that's pushing it a lot. And in recent years, we have not had success with that. So you really need to keep, I would say, at least 2 managers and then 3 people under each manager. Or you could have, each of the managers at least 2. So in that case, you would have 9 employees. So that's where we come up with the numbers. So again, if you're looking at buying an existing business, what are we looking at? We're looking at employee structure, number of employees. We're not looking at profitability so much. And we're looking at active and ongoing operations for the last 6 months that we can demonstrate and show. Here's all the licenses, here's the financials, P&L, here's tax returns, et cetera, to show that at least in the last 6 months, active ongoing operations. Now, why is an existing L1 better? The main advantage of an existing L1 is you're going to get that visa for 3 years initially, as opposed to a new startup L1 where you only get it for 1. So instead of, after 1 year having to renew, if you've got an existing business and you get it approved, you get it right away for 3 years. That's a big, big plus. And so if you qualify, then you might want to do it that way. Now, the problem that we've seen in doing this over several decades is sometimes people want to buy an existing business, but it doesn't meet these requirements. They only have, let's say, 5 employees, or they've only had active operations for the last 8, 9 months, not for the last 12 months, and we can't really demonstrate active operations. It's risky then to apply for an existing business L1 if you just don't meet the requirements. So that's something you need to discuss with your attorney to make sure you qualify. Now, the other option is an existing, we'll start all over here. The other type of L1 is a startup L1. And I would say, statistically speaking, we probably have more of these. That's where you're starting a company from scratch. And so additional steps that you have to take, you have to incorporate the business, which we can handle. You also have to prepare a business plan because there's no history behind the company. So they want to see, hey, what are you actually going to be doing? What are your prognoses, your estimates for profitability, expenditures, and stuff like that. And then they also want to see money coming into the U.S. company bank account that will support operations until the company becomes self-sustaining. So the amount of money you have to invest in a new company situation depends on the business plan. And so you can kind of finesse the business plan to show it being self-sustaining sooner or later. I would say on average, applicants have to put in maybe 60, 70, 80,000 at the start to launch the business and show that this money is what's needed before all the orders coming in, they could start generating revenue, et cetera. The exact amount really depends on the particular business. But unlike the E2, there's really no minimum amount. I mean, we've had people invest as little, maybe 40,000, 50,000. Or if it's a more capital intensive business, they might have to invest more than 100,000. That's the first major consideration for an L1 new business. You've got to start up the business, open the bank account, get any required licenses, and also secure space for the business. So if you've got an existing business L1, usually it's sufficient just to provide a lease agreement to show, hey, this is what we've been using for the last 5 years here. This guy purchased our business. He's going to take over the lease or the property. That's pretty straightforward with an existing company. With a new company L1, they're very particular about reviewing the business lease, looking at the property, making sure that there's enough space there for full-fledged operations when they're fully, ongoing and you've hired all the people. So what that means in a practical level is you need to rent or lease all the space that you're going to need to accommodate all of your employees that will be hired or who will be hired in that first year, even though you might not have any employees right now. And a lot of clients will say, hey, I'm going to have all my employees, but only in 8 or 9 months. Why do I need to rent an office right now to accommodate those people that I won't have for 6 or 8 months? Sorry, but that's just how the government requires, what they require. So you need to show that you've got adequate space on day one to accommodate all your employees, even though you might not hire them, for another 330 days. So that's something that you have to take into account. The other thing is they're very meticulous about reviewing the lease agreement. You also have to provide, photographs of the exterior of the building, the interior, the office space, have a workplace plan to show here we're going to hire 8 people. This is where they're all going to sit. Or maybe some people are working remotely or they're working in the warehouse, but you've got to explain all of this to show them the adequate space for everybody on day one. Now, maybe the good things about with a startup L1 visa is you don't have to hire anybody before you file, and you don't even have to have ongoing operations or any revenue before you file. So that, in theory, is a benefit. But there are a number of other requirements that are similar for both the L1 existing business and the L1 new business that we will get into here in a moment. Actually, we'll take a break here, but let's continue and add this section about the business plan that's specific only to the L1A, the L1 new business. I should add one other requirement of a new business L1 that's not true for an existing business is the need for a business plan. It's a pretty formalistic business plan. It doesn't need to go into all of the nuances, for example, as is the case with an EB-5. But the L1 business plan has to show projections for the next 5 years, adequately describe what the operations are and what they will be, and show that the amount of money that's being invested at the start of the whole process, the investment process, that money is sufficient to maintain operations until the company becomes self-sustaining. So the business plan can obviously be crafted a little bit to meet the needs of the client, to meet their budget, etc. But again, that's a requirement for a new office L1 petition, but not for an existing L1 petition. Now let's get into a number of the details and nuances and requirements that are equally true for both existing office and a new company L1 applications. So to continue our discussion, this section of our video, I'd like to talk a little bit more about what's required for any L1 petition, whether it's an existing company or a new startup situation. So what are the general requirements for an L1? In part, we've discussed this so far. There's requirements of both the foreign company, and then there's also requirements that relate to the US company. Let's start with the foreign company. First of all, you need to show that it's a company that's been operating for at least a year over the past, 3 years at least. But it has to be at least operating at least for a year. Where does that 1 year requirement come from? Because remember, we talked about the employment requirement that the applicant has to show that he or she's worked for the overseas company for at least 1 year in the previous 3 years. That's the first requirement. It's working for at least a year. Then we have to show that the applicant has actually worked there. So that means not just being a shareholder, you have to actually have a position in the company. So if it's an L1A, most cases you're the executive, chief executive, president, something like that. Just having a position on a board or just being a shareholder is not sufficient. You have to be employed, in the case of an L1A, as an executive, or an L1B as a specialized knowledge worker. In addition, we have to provide the proof of that employment. So we need to provide payroll statements, etc., for the previous 12 months, showing that this person really did receive a salary over the previous 12 months. In addition, what else is needed? Well, you need to show registration documents for the foreign company, any licenses that would be required. You have to provide photographs of the actual operation, the office, warehouse, premises, whatever you have, and also a lease agreement showing that this is a long-term ongoing business. You have a long-term lease, that you're not just going to close up the business after you get the L1 and disappear. You also have to show, at least in the case of an L1A, that you've been managing a large enough staff of people over the last time. Generally, we tell our clients 10 individuals or more. So if you might have a company that's been working for, let's say, 5 years, but if you only have 3, 4, 5, 6 employees, that's just not going to work these days. There were times back maybe 10, 15 years ago, we had clients with as few as 3 or 4 employees overseas, and they were getting approved. Those days are long gone. These days, we generally say at least 10 employees overseas. And the other thing is, it's not just 10 employees like 10 painters, 10 window washers, stuff like that. They want to see the same thing as in the US company side, where there's a executive, mid-level managers, and then the lower workers. So you want to have that 3-tier structure in any scenario or any case for the foreign company. That, for the most part, is the foreign company. Now, actually, I should add one more thing that's really important. We have to provide a letter that goes into great detail what your employment requirements were while you were working for the foreign company. So what does that mean? We have to provide a percentage breakdown to say, 20% of your time was spent on the following, 10% of your time was spent on this, 30% was spent doing this, and give lots of details about what you spent the time doing, how much time you spent it, who you were managing or overseeing. That letter is super, super important. And I think a lot of clients, first of all, don't even know about it, or if they do know about this requirement, they don't do it in adequate enough detail, because they really look at it, who are you overseeing, who are your direct subordinates, who's responsible this, who reports to you, what tasks are you doing, etc. And in the case of an L1A, why is this so important? Because you're showing that you are playing the role as an executive. And if you're only overseeing 4 people and you're just counting the money in the bank, you're not involved in overseeing the financial issues and the operational issues and the marketing, they're probably not going to give you the L1. So that's why that letter is very important. Now, if we go to the US side of things, similar requirements, but again, it depends if it's a new office or an existing office situation. Let's start with the existing office situation. So if you're buying an existing business for an L1, but there's only 3 people that work there, forget it. It's not going to work. You have too few people. You need to have, like I said, that 8 employees or more, 8, 9, 10 at a minimum for an existing business L1. We also have to show, what activities you're going to be doing as the executive, all this other stuff. But the main requirement for that existing business L1 is the number of employees and their structure in the personnel structure, etc. So that's the main criteria for the existing business L1. Most of our clients, I don't know if this is true for other lawyers, but I would say most of our clients have a startup L1 situation. And so what does that entail? Well, first of all, again, I'll remind you, startup L1, you get the visa only for a year, unlike the existing L1, existing business where you get it for 3 years right away. And so what you have to do at the end of that 1 year, so at the startup L1, you have to do a business plan. You don't with an existing. You don't have to have any employees, but at the end of that first year, you're going to have the 8 or 9 employees at a minimum to get the L1 renewed. And that's probably the biggest challenge for the L1, because going up from 0 employees to 9 or 10, that's a bit of a challenge. That could be a challenge depending on your business plan and your business model and stuff like that. So that's the biggest difference between those two. But again, otherwise, same stuff that we talked about, the foreign company. You're going to have to provide photos of the office space, whether it's a startup or an existing business. Those photos of the office space are more important for a startup because they want to make sure, okay, is this a real legitimate office? Or are you kind of making this up that you're really going to open an office? So we have to provide photos of the signage, photos of, even in the hallway we do a lot of times where there's a big board that says, Suite 101 has this company, Suite 102. So they want to make sure this is a real business. And in addition, we have to provide a lease agreement that's valid for at least a year and a floor plan. Shows all the measurements, how big are the spaces that you've got, who's sitting where, what's the division, the allocation of workstations, stuff like that. So they're really picky about that kind of stuff with an L1. Questions that often come up is, can we use a co-working space? Not with an L1. Now, you could maybe, a co-working company like WeWork or Regis, they might rent out individual rooms to you. And if those rooms are adequate for your staff and you're the sole occupants of those rooms, nobody else can use them, then those should be okay for an L1. But if it's just a co-working space where today you sit at this desk, tomorrow you sit at another one, that won't work ever for an L1. Now, a couple other facets or requirements of the new company L1 that we didn't talk about. We talked about the business plan, the lease agreement, everything else. Of course, before that, you have to get the company registered. So you got to file for registration with the company. You have to get an EIN number because that EIN number is what allows you to hire employees. And it's also what allows you to open a bank account. So you need to get a bank account in the US. Now, we can do all of these actions remotely for our clients, meaning we can register the company remotely, get the EIN number from the IRS, prepare your whole petition, but to get a bank account, a new bank account, with very, very few exceptions, there's maybe 1 or 2 banks in the US that still can do bank account openings, but if you want a conventional bank, Chase, Citibank, Bank of America, stuff like that, the controlling shareholder or shareholders have to come into a local branch. So that can be a problem if you don't have access to the US. And we as your attorneys can't open that bank account for you. So that's an issue that could be a problem for some people if they don't have a tourist visa or an ESTA that allows them to easily come to the US. Now there is one good workaround we recommend to our clients if they can't get to the US. Assuming you're from a country that doesn't have any kind of limitations on working with online platforms, WISE works very well as a substitute for a conventional bank. So it's a payment platform kind of like PayPal. It's called WISE, WISE.com. So WISE, WISE.com. It works and operates just like a US bank. So if you send in bank statements using WISE, stuff like that, We've used that repeatedly. That works very well for our clients if you can't get to the US to open the bank account. So in the startup situation, what else do you need to prove? Well, you've got to show basically that everything's ready for the business to launch operations once you get the L-1 visa approved. If you can launch operations before the visa, that's great. That gives you a little bit more evidence to provide to the officer. But if you can't launch the operations, we've got to have everything ready, meaning you got to buy the equipment, you got to install equipment, you have to get all the local licenses. Everything has to be ready, except maybe the employees, so that when you get here on that L-1, boom, you can immediately start working, or you can immediately hire the employees you need to hire to get the business up and running. Timing is also an important issue. Let's talk about that for a little bit. So there's two aspects of timing. How long does it take to get the case ready? And how long does it take to get it approved? To get an L-1 case prepared and filed, I would say on average 2 to 3 months. Just by the time you get everything done, do the strategy, get everything set up, all that. If you're opening a new business from scratch, probably at least 3 months and quite likely more. It just takes more time to get the company registered. You have to get the bank account open. That might take you more time than expected. Get the business plan ready, etc. But I would say between 2 and 4 months, that's kind of an average time frame to prepare the L-1 and file it. We file all L-1 petitions with USCIS. You don't file it with the embassy like you can do with an E-2. Now they do have premium processing, meaning within 15 business days you can get a decision, or you can do standard processing. I'll be honest, I can't remember the last time somebody did not use premium processing. I mean, 99% of our clients do that, because otherwise you're probably looking at a 6-month wait time. So probably 99% do premium processing. Wait about 15 days, you get it approved. Once it gets approved, if you're here in the US and you indicated in your application that you want to change status here, your status immediately changes that day. Now, if your family's here with you, their status will change later after their petition is reviewed. That can take anywhere from 3 to 6 months, additional time to get the spouse and the child or children status is changed. Now, you got to keep in mind, if you're the main applicant, you got your new status, your husband or your wife and your children are still waiting, you cannot leave the US until they get that change of status. Because if you leave the US and their case hasn't been reviewed yet, then they have no grounds for changing status, because their grounds is based on your L-1. And if you're out of the country, your L-1 is technically not in effect. So just keep that in mind. That's a common mistake people make. If your spouse and children are changing here, you've got to keep their status, you've got to stay here in your L-1 before they get their change of status. Now, if you're doing this at the embassy, how does that work? Well, after you get the approval from USCIS, you take your approval notice. You don't need that when you're setting up the interview, but you will need that when you go in for the interview. You select the country of your residence or citizenship, sign up for an L-1 interview, and then you and your family have to go in there for the interview. They usually don't ask the spouse any questions about the business. It's usually focused just on the main applicant. How quickly you can get in for the interview really depends on the embassy. Some embassies, gosh, as quickly as maybe 2 weeks, 3 weeks. Some it might be 2 or 3 months. It just varies. So I would say from start to finish, an average time frame, I would say if you're going to the embassy, is probably 4 to 6 months. That's about an average time frame. If you're doing it in the US, it's probably a little bit faster, but it costs more money and it takes longer for the spouse and the children to get their status in the US. So that's something to keep in mind when choosing between these two options. What's important for a successful L-1 petition? What is the government really looking at? I would say, in having done this almost 2 decades, there's 2 main issues they focus on. It's not revenue, it's not profitability, it's not necessarily your skill set, although for an L-1B they do look at your skills. 2 most important things for an L-1, in particular an L-1A, is what are your job duties going to be here? Are they truly executive or managerial job duties? And how large of a personnel pool or how large is your team that you're going to be managing to justify having an executive here? So like I mentioned, remember, you want to have 8 or 10 employees here or more to get the L-1 approved and then to have any renewals. So that's a very important thing that they look at. The other important thing that they look at is, what are your job duties? Are you truly going to be working as an executive or manager, or are you going to be the one doing all the work and you're just putting these employees on here for window dressing to make it look like a real business? They want to be sure that your job duties are executive in nature. So they want to make sure you're not going to be the one calling clients. You're not going to be the one producing the product. You're not going to be the one, doing all the financials and the financial statements and the taxes. You're just going to be managing people who will be doing that work. So that's really important, especially for the L1A, that you're managing and serving as an executive and overseeing those processes. But you yourself are not doing that. Now, of course, in that first year, they give you some slack and they allow you to do that because you don't have employees at that point. You're still bringing up the team. So they'll give you some consideration in that first year and say, look, first year while you're hiring your people, sure, do the client calling. You can do the taxes because you don't yet have a team in place. But by the end of that first year, having that team is super critical for you getting either an initial approval or an extension. So in closing, hopefully this was helpful in giving you a good understanding of what's kind of involved in the nuts and bolts of an L1 and making sure you get an approved petition. As I mentioned, it requires focus on the details, on your job duties and other aspects, both of your employment overseas as well as your expected employment in the US. In our next and final episode, we're going to talk about some of the remaining issues about doing renewals, how to maybe use an L1 as a springboard to a green card, and other aspects related to the L1 visa. Check out our links below to get more information. More importantly, if you're ready to make that process or make that jump to an L1 and you want to have an individualized consultation with myself or someone on our team, please use one of the links below in the description to get you set up. Otherwise, stay posted for episode number 3, where we have some conclusory overview of the process.